compactly represent a range of principles across the cosmological, psychological, and evolutionary realms. The alphabet itself is divided into 3 parts, or 3 ets, with 8 characters each, and I'd like to offer an interpretation of these ets and some of these characters, obviously based on existing interpretations. But the very first character of the first et is known as Fehu, which is some kind of a primal fire, and it represents wealth. So wealth along many different dimensions. So if we consider that wealth to be, for example, like consciousness, light, love, the second character is Uruz, and it really literally means ice or frozenness, and it is the opposite of the primal fire. So there's an implication that whatever wealth is there becomes its opposite over here. So the consciousness becoming unconsciousness, life becoming death, love becoming hate, light becoming darkness, and so on. And this Uruz is then the start of a cosmological journey. The next character is Thurisas, which is some kind of a chaos. And if we think of it as emerging from Uruz, then that makes sense, because if the principles of unconsciousness, death, darkness, hate are embedded in here as starting points, then the first emergence is going to be one of a giant chaos. Now, as a kind of intervention, we may think of the next character, Algus, which is, one can argue or see that it's kind of an intervention from Fehu, and there's also a similarity in the characters themselves. And this represents some kind of positive cosmic principles, or what may be referred to as gods. And from Algus itself, we have Rido, which is a way, so it's a certain way that's set up by these positive cosmic principles. And from here we have another character, Kenaz, which represents knowledge or illumination. And perhaps this illumination refers to the illumination that comes from following the path that's laid out by Rido. And then we have another very interesting character, Gabriel, which is gift. And my interpretation of this is that, in fact, it's also an intervention from Fehu to endow the cosmology or the cosmos with its own native primal fire embedded into it. So we see that there's a downward pointing triangle, if you will, and there's, from here is the rest of creation. And this becomes like a kind of a trump card, which we'll see in the further ets that are played out. The final character of the first et, this cosmological et, is known as Wunjo, and this means joy or perfection. And this would be the result of employing this gabor or gift that's provided by Fehu to the active development, any kind of cosmological or psychological development. So the first et is on a macro or cosmological scale and represents some very deep principles of forces in the structure of space. The second et is coming down to a more micro level, and if we look at the characters, the first character is Hagales, and Hagales can be thought of as a number of habits that are ingrained within any kind of individual construction, and from these habits a future is created. So there's a need. The character is called Nothias, which is need, and we have a further character, Isa, which is ice, and this represents everything, all the habits that are frozen or that cause a perpetuity of the past. And so one can see a kind of a parallel on a micro scale between these larger macro principles and these micro principles here. And just as we have the intervention from Fehu of Ansus, here there's a journey. This character Jira is a harvest or journey and represents a kind of reversal of these deep habits that themselves are the result of the play of some aspects of these cosmic principles. Now, when this kicks in, what it means is that these past habits can be reversed, and we see in the subsequent characters of the second act the character of Evas, which represents the world tree, or in Norse mythology, Yggdrasil, and its deeper significance is supposed to be a kind of a sacrifice by an individual. So it's a deep psychological sacrifice along many of the worlds or layers of the world tree. And when this happens, then these habits over here that had locked any kind of individual construct into a particular narrow way of being have a chance of being expanded out. So we see the next character, Berthro, and Berthro is, in this interpretation, a way of seeing much larger than a narrow realm. So we allow a lot more light to come into the narrowness of these habits. And as a result of allowing that, there's a character, Algus, which is a character of protection. And we can see that there is a similarity. There's this upward or this downward pointing triangle that is a trump or a gift from Fehu, and it allows a certain protection amongst the active psychology or the development that's going to take place that is constrained by these three characters over here. And as a result, we have the character of Soilu, which is sun or emerging into a greater consciousness. And so if we think about this, this is a on the micro scale and is psychological in nature, and it represents an active psychology by which some of these constraining habits can be broken when this harvest of Jira occurs. And this is the psychology that needs to go through in order to expand these constraining habits. And further, we see a kind of a mapping or a parallel between the characters in the cosmological ed and the psychological ed. So Rado, which is a path, has a parallel with the character of Ewats, which is also a certain path. And then Kenas, or illumination, has a parallel with Prithro, or seen very differently. So there's a aspect of illumination that takes place. We have Gebo, which is the force of Fehu spreading into the cosmos but hidden. And here again the force of Fehu, the downward pointing triangle, forming a protection and an active kind of foothold to break these constraining habits. And then we have Soulu, or sun, the rising of consciousness, which is kind of a parallel to Wenjo, or this joy of perfection that occurs. And we have a third et, which is really an evolutionary et. So when we look at these characters, that becomes clearer. So we have the first character, Taiwas, which represents an Iron Age. But if we look subsequently at the next characters, we have Berkana, which is a plant age. We have Ewas, which is a animal age. Ewas itself means horse. This gives rise to Manas, which is a age of humankind. So we're seeing a progression here from iron to plant to animal to man, so representing a shift in consciousness. And then we have Algus, which is an era of feeling, so that's getting in touch with kind of hidden forces of intuition. And then we have Ingwas, which represents kind of a deep character that is, I think, related to this gift of Ansus. And as a result of this, there's an integration that takes place. So there's an inheritance that becomes possible because of these deep forces or the positive cosmological principles in space. And this is Othello. And then we have Dagas, which has embedded in it the X as well, and represents being able to sacrifice oneself or surrender oneself to the deep principle of Fehu, and essentially move beyond the whole realm of Othello. The Norse kind of interpretation of this is Ragnarok, meaning that there is a overcoming of past gods and a emergence of new kinds of gods or cosmic principles. And so here we see that this is certainly from iron to plant to animal to humankind to intuition to merging with cosmic principles to an integration to moving beyond all this and becoming a representation of primal fire itself. And in order to move from one step to the other, there's this whole active psychology that has to happen at each of these steps by the actors that are represented or that are contained in each of these various phases in this evolutionary ed. And so in this interpretation, again, summarizing, we have three eds: a cosmological ed, a psychological ed, and an evolutionary ed. And we can represent this on a time-space graph, if you will. So time, if we take this third ed, which is the evolutionary ed, then essentially we can lay out from bottom to top, Taiwas to Dagas. And we have here space on this axis, and space, as suggested, has a structure to it, and the structure is hinted at by these deep principles, these cosmological principles, and the possibility that whatever emerges in time is related to what's ingrained in space. And as we see these play out, there's many different paths that can happen. So for example, it's possible that we're stuck at one level, if you will, and so this could be a possible path, or it's possible there's another path that we stay at some level and then accelerate up, or we began really high and we accelerate down, or there's a progressive going back and forth between the levels. And really the key to these various kinds of movements or paths through the cosmos is related to this the psychology, the active psychology that's employed. And so here we have a complete cosmology, because we have the evolutionary ed that's represented on the time axis, we have the cosmological ed that's represented on the space axis, and we have the psychological ed that really will indicate the path that's taken through time and space to come up with a different kind of cosmos than we currently have.